0630 local time. The sea between Greenland's southern coast and the Labrador Sea was the color of gunmetal, churned by February swells that would swallow a lesser fleet whole. And into that freezing gray corridor, something unprecedented was moving. French President Emmanuel Macron, cornered by Washington's increasingly aggressive posturing over Greenland's sovereignty, had ordered the crown jewel of the Marine Nationale, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, hull number R91, to lead a full carrier strike group directly into waters the U.S. Northern Command had quietly designated a military exclusion corridor. Not a diplomatic protest, not a United Nations resolution, a carrier, France's only carrier. Moving at flank speed toward American patrolled waters, its flight deck loaded with Rafale M multi-role fighters and its escorts fanned out in a combat formation that left zero ambiguity about intent. In the White House Situation Room, the temperature dropped before any admiral said a word. Paris believed Washington would blink. After all, France is not Venezuela or Iran. France is a nuclear power, a founding NATO member, a nation with 35,000 active military personnel deployed globally. Macron calculated that meeting American aggression with European firepower would fracture Trump's unilateral Greenland strategy and force a negotiation. A rational calculation on paper. What Paris did not know, could not have known, was that the intercept they were walking into had been planned 7 weeks earlier, in a room that does not appear on any Pentagon organizational chart. The U.S. Navy's Second Fleet, reactivated in 2018 specifically to counter Russian and great power threats in the North Atlantic, had its flagship USS Gerald R. Ford, a $13.3 billion electromagnetic supercarrier with 4.5 acres of flight deck and a crew of 5,000, already repositioned 280 nautical miles southwest of Cape Farewell. The Ford had been there for 9 days, waiting. But this is where the situation fractures into something far stranger than a US-France standoff. Because the moment the Charles de Gaulle entered the Davis Strait, something that had been coiling in the deep water to the northeast began to move. The Russian Northern Fleet Submarine Command in Severomorsk had been watching the NATO confrontation develop for 6 days. And what Moscow's general staff saw was not a crisis. It was an opening. The kind of environmental chaos that submariners dream about. 2 superpower fleets stirring the entire water column into acoustic hell, active sonar pinging from every direction, aircraft engines churning overhead, hull noise from dozens of warships masking everything beneath 200 meters. In that noise, Russia saw cover. The order went out at 0200 Moscow time. 2 Yasen M-class nuclear attack submarines, Kazan and Novosibirsk, the quietest boats the Russian Navy has ever commissioned, slipped their patrol positions north of the Gyayuki Gap and turned their bows southwest. Understand what the Yasen M represents. Each vessel costs roughly $1.6 billion. Their pump jet propulsors generate acoustic signatures so faint that previous generations of NATO hydrophone arrays frequently lost contact within an hour of detection. They carry 3 M22 Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles capable of reaching Mach 9 in terminal phase, fast enough that a salvo launched from mid-Atlantic would reach the U.S. eastern seaboard with approximately 4 minutes of warning. The Russian Navy has fewer than a handful of them operational. Sending 2 simultaneously into a contested zone was not a casual decision. Moscow was betting its most valuable underwater assets on a single intelligence premise. The Franco-American confrontation would blind NATO's undersea surveillance long enough to move those submarines through the Gyayuki Gap undetected. It was a reasonable premise built entirely on wrong assumptions. At 0800 hours, the Charles de Gaulle and her escorts entered the operational zone in a manner that no naval professional watching the data feed could quite believe. The French formation was radiating, every system active, the carrier's DRBI-21 long-range radar spinning at full power. Rafale M jets performing low passes along the coast of Greenland, their own sensors lit up, bouncing radar energy off American installations. French frigates hammering the seabed with active sonar at intervals that made the water sound like a construction site. On the surface, it looked like aggression bordering on recklessness. Military analysts at Northcom watching the feeds couldn't understand why a professional navy would make itself this loud. The answer, of course, is that they hadn't lost their minds. They were making noise on purpose. The White House press secretary's statement that day, delivered with deliberate flatness, that European forces cannot influence the president's strategic decisions regarding Greenland was not a diplomatic fumble. It was the public face of a trap that had already been set. the classified component of the US-France Coordination Agreement, signed 43 days earlier, was a joint anti-submarine deception operation. The confrontation was theater. Paris's contribution was electromagnetic chaos. Washington's contribution was everything else. Inside the Combat Direction Center aboard the Gerald R. Ford, officers were not watching the French formation. They were watching what the French formation was driving. At 11:27 hours, a passive sonar contact materialized at the edge of a hydrophone field that had been quietly repositioned over the previous 3 weeks. The Kazan had increased speed to 20 knots to exploit what her captain assessed as a closing window. The Franco-American confrontation wouldn't generate this much cover noise indefinitely. Speed was necessary. Speed was also fatal. At 20 knots, even the Yarzenem's pump jet begins to sing. Not loudly, but these hydrophones weren't the previous generation. Here's what the French 15 combat specialists actually were. The press received a briefing that described a small advisory contingent of French soldiers embedded on Greenland for liaison purposes. That number was accurate. The description was not. Those 15 personnel were a joint US-French acoustic warfare team, inserted by MH-60R Seahawk helicopters onto ice formations along the projected submarine transit route 9 days prior. Each pair of operators had drilled through ice pack and deployed AN/SSQ-125 multi-static active coherent sonobuoys connected to a relay network feeding directly into the Ford's tactical data system. When the Kazan accelerated, her acoustic profile was triangulated by 7 independent sensor nodes simultaneously. The contact solution was precise to within 40 meters. At 13:47 hours, the second contact resolved. Novosibirsk, running 11 nautical miles behind the Kazan in a staggered trail formation. Both submarines located, both plotted on the same tactical display. Neither crew with any indication they had been found. The decision to end the operation came from 2nd Fleet Command at 1420. No weapons. The objective was not destruction. The objective was humiliation and intelligence harvest. 2 things that serve American deterrence far longer than wreckage on the ocean floor. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers from the US formation and 2 French Horizon-class frigates executed a coordinated turn. Their course changes were unremarkable individually. Collectively, they formed an acoustic vice. Active sonar transducers on all 5 vessels swung to bear on the precise coordinates of both submarines and fired simultaneously at maximum output. In water, sound is not a nuisance. At 235 decibels, focused and sustained, sound is a weapon. The pressure wave transmits directly through a steel hull. Inside the Kazan, the effect was immediate. Instruments overloaded. Crew members reported disorientation and acute pain. The boat's automated damage control systems flagged multiple sensor failures within the first 40 seconds. The Novosibirsk fared no better. A pair of P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, each capable of carrying 8 Mk-54 lightweight torpedoes, alongside an array of sonobuoys and magnetic anomaly detectors, descended from 25,000 feet and placed a ring of active sonobuoys around both submarines at 500-meter intervals. Not weapons. Offensive sound. The message required no translation. Every bearing the Russian captains could model led directly through NATO assets that had already demonstrated they knew exactly where both boats were. The Kazan surfaced at 15:08. Novosibirsk followed 11 minutes later. Both submarines broke the surface into the field of view of US and French reconnaissance aircraft that had been orbiting at altitude since before the operation began. Their hull configurations, exhaust signatures, antenna arrays, and acoustic profiles were recorded in full across every spectrum NATO surveillance platforms can access. The Yarzen-M had been classified as a near-invisible threat for a decade. In the span of one afternoon, its acoustic signature was catalogued with enough fidelity that it will be recognized anywhere in the world's oceans for the next 20 years. Russia did not lose 2 submarines. Russia lost the invisibility that made those submarines worth deploying. The final revelation arrived via satellite data processed in the hours after the operation concluded. The Charles de Gaulle was never where Russian radar had plotted her. The carrier's emission signature had been replicated by electronic warfare pods mounted on 3 Danish support vessels operating under radio silence in a different sector entirely. The radar returns, the communication intercepts, the apparent carrier formation that Moscow's Northern Fleet Command had been tracking for 6 days. All of it was a simulation. A $2 billion carrier projection generated by equipment costing less than a single Rafale airframe. Russia had maneuvered its most advanced strategic assets to shadow a ghost. The one real fighting force France contributed to the operation was 15 people lying on ice with headphones. That detail alone will be studied in naval war colleges for a generation. What this operation revealed goes beyond one confrontation in the Davis Strait. The Arctic has been reframed. What Russia calculated as a contested region offering geographic ambiguity now functions as a surveillance network that NATO has spent years quietly building under the ice, on the ice, and above it. The noise that Charles de Gaulle made wasn't recklessness, it was the bait. The quiet was the weapon. And the silence that followed, the moment Kazan's conning tower broke the surface and every camera aboard every orbiting aircraft locked on. That silence cost Moscow more than any missile ever could. The Russian submarines retreated north under escort of NATO observation aircraft, their captains aware of something that no official communique will ever formally confirm. They had been inside a trap the entire time, and the trap had been built so carefully they had walked in convinced they were hunters. The question that now sits in Moscow's planning cells is not whether NATO can track the Yas and M. That question has been answered. The question is what else NATO knows that it hasn't yet demonstrated. Because the most dangerous capability is the one your adversary hasn't shown you yet. The Arctic corridor to the Atlantic is no longer an equation Russia can solve with stealth alone. The mathematics changed in the Davis Strait, and they changed permanently. What do you think, after losing the acoustic invisibility that anchored their underwater deterrent strategy? Will Russian naval doctrine pivot toward quantity over quality, or is this the kind of institutional blow that takes a decade to process and rebuild from? And do you believe the US-France coordination visible here signals a deeper realignment in NATO's northern posture? Or was this a one-time operational marriage of convenience? Drop your read on it in the comments. Perspectives from people who actually analyze these systems are worth more than the official statements. If this breakdown added something to your understanding of how modern deterrence actually operates, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The next file covers a layer of this Arctic strategy that hasn't surfaced publicly yet, and it changes how you'll read every future statement out of both Washington and Moscow. Don't miss it.